Yes, so that's work. Thank you. So that's kind of what we're about in Work in Progress. And Cleo, you can introduce yourself and University Rebellion.
Yes, so hi, I'm Cleo. I'm an activist at University Rebellion Utrecht. So for the people that don't know University Rebellion, it's a national movement across the Netherlands, and every student city has a local group of University Rebellion. And so our common concern is that the university doesn't do enough about the climate, ecological and social crisis we are in. So we want to challenge our universities to act according to their responsibility, holding them accountable by organizing and coordinating decentralized actions against failing university policy. And so I'm from the local group of Utrecht.
Yes, thank you. So to the events of today, why we have come together. We got together and we've decided to host this event entitled A Just Transition, where environmentalism meets anti-racism. And this topic was inspired a lot by the 2021 United Nations Climate Change Conference, or COP26, which sparked much debate within the climate community and beyond about where many individuals and organizations and countries called out the social injustices that are caused by and are consequences of the climate crisis. And for many, there were many more questions than answers after the COP26. So we thought it would be important to not only spotlight some of those issues, but also dig deeper into the systematic, cultural, and normalized practices that actually uphold and actually bolster environmental injustices around the world and on different scales. So this conversation, we hope to look at topics around nature, science, environmental justice movements, and climate change, and how they intersect with topics around identity, colonialism, and anti-racism. And as a result, we hope that this discussion will help people understand how these concepts can be applied in our everyday lives, in our communities, and in our organizations, so we can move towards a just transition. So we have invited 4 amazing panelists here with a wide range of experiences and expertise to help kind of get to the bottom of some of these questions. And we will briefly introduce them. So first we have Chihiro Geuzenbroek. I hope I pronounced that well enough. She is a trained organizer and activist advancing perspectives and practices to restore and restore our relationship with the earth and each other. She co-founded the decolonial organization Racialized, and gives training around anti-oppression strategies with climate change movement, and produced a climate justice film, spoken word, and short videos. She worked for Greenpeace and Milieu Defensie and grassroots organizations such as Code Root, Fossil Free Culture, trained Fridays for Future Youth EU 2019, and provided training series for Extinction Rebellion. So thank you, Chihiro, for being here with us. We also have here Thomas Ngoga, born, raised in Malawi with roots in Belgium and Rwanda, with ambitions to study in the field of geoscience, sustainability, energy, and resources that will eventually lead to working in the private and development sector in low-income areas. Thomas has corporate experience in logistics and operations of multinational companies, and he's just your basic down-to-earth dude who thinks conversations around environment and racism is plagued by identity association and a lack of local awareness. So we're very interested to hear what he has to say about that. So thank you, Thomas. Cleo?
Yes, now introduce Evelyn and Raki. So first, Evelyn, thank you for joining us. You are a climate activist from Uganda. You are in Rise Up Movement National. You're the Rise Up Movement National Coordinator and Secretary, a member of Fridays for Future, and an Arctic Angel with Global Choices. She participated in educating school children about climate change and the +3 EG project, which is targeting to plant over 9 million fruit trees in households in her country, Uganda. Thank you for joining us. Then Raki App works as a civil servant as the Ministry of Interior. He is also a political refugee and human rights and climate activist. He is the spokesperson for the Free West Papua campaign, representing the indigenous people of West Papua. He tells the story of West Papua with passion, and one that includes all elements like politics, human rights, and environmentalism. In the Netherlands, his mission is to give the climate debate a more indigenous perspective. Thank you for joining us as well.
Yes, at this point we would hear applause. But so yes, so before we dive in, the program today is very simple. We'll have about an hour and 20 minutes of panel discussion with a 10 to 15 minute break in between, so don't worry. You don't have to stay here for an hour and 20 minutes. But then we'll also leave some time at the end for audience members to ask questions. You are allowed to pose questions throughout the discussion as well, so you don't have to hold on to your questions to the end. We'll note them as we go along. And yeah, so let's just dive in. And I was hoping we could start with the definition of a just transition. And this one comes from the Climate Justice Alliance. And it states that a just transition is based on a set of principles, processes, and practices that build economic and political powers to shift from an extractive economy to a regenerative economy. And the transition itself must be just and equitable, readdressing past human harms and creating new relationships of power for the future through reparations. A just transition describes both where we are going and how we get there. And I wanted to pose this question to everyone, and maybe we can start with Rocky, perhaps. Do you agree with this definition of a just transition? And what key things are important to consider when we speak of a just transition?
Thank you, Candice, firstly for the amazing introduction both of you have given to us. And regarding to jump into this big question, I can say that I'm partly agree with it, and partly because if we reflect on the current state of our planet, we can see that some people on this planet are causing the mess we have here, and some people, and I'm pointing to indigenous peoples, where the UN scientists have said that just 5% of world's population exists of indigenous peoples, and that their way of life have preserved more than 80% of world's remaining biodiversity. So some of the peoples are basically part of the Earth's crucial ecosystem. So they don't have to join this transition, but other ones who have created this mess are the ones who should make this just transition. So that's a bit the context of, from my point of view as indigenous climate activists, is to reflect who have created these structures and brought us in the situation. I think those societies who are on the power buttons nowadays in COP26, we have seen who are not capable to refine that structures to make the just transition, are still having a big say. So, and if we look at those who don't need to make that just transition because they are part of these crucial ecosystems and their way of life are basically the ones that we should learn from, are the ones who just can continue to do what they're doing best, which is preserving our ecosystem. And we here must learn. What can we learn from them? That is I think my point regarding this question. Back to you.
And thank you. That is very enlightening. And you brought up some good points that we'll hopefully cover also as we go through the discussion. But I also wanted to perhaps get Evelyn's point of view on this same question.
Thank you so much, Candice. I kind of liked what Raki mentioned about the indigenous people not necessarily being part of a just transition, because yeah, I understand their connection with the ecosystems and nature. And yes, I do agree again when you talk about the definition of a just transition. I agree when you say that it should be equitable, and by it being equitable, they should make sure they're listening to voices of people from most affected areas, their solutions, and including them in decision-making room processes, and to also help them recognize or to help these communities that have already caused the climate crisis recognize their part in causing this crisis and centering the voices of people from most affected communities. So to me, that is what I understand by an equitable transition. But again, a just transition will also start from meaningful action, not just promises from conferences. Like the COP26 that we just had was a disappointment for so many of us from most affected communities from the Global South. It was so much of a disappointment because first of all, so many of our voices were not heard. We were not given a chance. Like I said, they need to include us in decision-making rooms, but these voices were not added to the decision-making rooms, and this is very unfair. And again, the different commitments that were made at COP, like that different commitments that are made at COP do not favor again the people from most affected communities, like the 100 billion US dollars that has been promised to be delivered to the countries that are already being affected by the climate crisis by 2020 has never been delivered. And again, at COP, we did not hear them talk much about it. And yet this money is supposed to help people in adaptation and mitigation. But again, my friend Vanessa always states that there are some things that we cannot adapt to, like we cannot adapt to lost ecosystems, we cannot adapt to extinction. There's some things that we cannot adapt to. And again, I could talk about loss and damages. That commitment that they failed to acknowledge that we need the money for loss and damages. So for me, I believe all these commitments that they make at COP are going to contribute to a just transition. It's not going to be equitable if only communities that have the resources to transition to renewable energy or to a more fairer world are the ones transitioning, and we are being left behind.
Thank you. And I think you both make very good points about this kind of this conversation about responsibility, and also the realities that some countries in the global south don't necessarily have the means to maybe adapt in the same ways that countries do in the global north. And I hope we can talk about that in a minute. But there's something that Rocky mentioned about indigenous approaches and indigenous communities that are often really overlooked in these kind of conversations. And I was wondering, Chihiro, perhaps you can enlighten us. What does an indigenous approach to environmental justice and conservation look like? And how can this be incorporated into the climate change movement as a whole in your experience? And
Yes. Well, first I would start by speaking of plurality, because there's no such thing as one indigenous way. There are 5,000 different indigenous peoples. Some have their roots in as pastoralist, others in hunter-gatherer type of societies or economies, different politics. But one thing that indigenous tribes and nations share is an understanding of being a place-based people. So when you're a place-based people, you know that your place doesn't grow, the earth doesn't grow. So you know how to live adapted to that earth instead of having a growth economy, a growth politics, a growth culture, a growth ideology. That growth is only possible if you want to encroach on others, if you want to colonize other frontline communities. So I think in the basis of an indigenous approach to environmental repair or environmental work is that it's informed by the land, so it's very contextualized, and that it's informed by relationship. And so there's no such thing as just plugging a different energy source in and then thinking you are sustainable, because you can plug in the windmills and still be extractive towards mines in DRC and still rob resources for other renewable energies. So it comes with relationship with humans, relationships with minerals, relationships with the plant and animal lives. And so in terms of process, that relationality would definitely also be something that I would put in the definition of just transition, because now it says it's based on a set of principles, processes, and practices. And from an Indigenous way of understanding world, it would start with all our relations with the web of life. So I would say principles like relationship repair and principles, processes, and practices. But that relationship repair is really at the source of the environmental work. And that's why environmental work from an Indigenous perspective is always both healing and revolutionary, because you go up against the logic of growth and encroachment and displacement and dispossession. So that requires struggle, like real embodied struggle, as well as that it requires community that has been divided by divide and conquer, and violence and force and internalized oppression and post-traumatic chronic stress disorder. So it also always requires healing, and it requires cultural practices like ceremony and things that bring back community into a wholesome way of being together. And so I think that self-care or us care, like self-care is kind of a individualistic way of thinking our activist practices to be about care, but this us care of community and this requiring it not just being a conversation, but a revolutionary struggle, those two elements would definitely be very central to the process of and the way of understanding this environmental work.
Thank you, Gio, for this very good for your enlightenments. Maybe we can make it a bit more specific to the Netherlands. Raki, in what ways does climate change disproportionately harm Black, Indigenous, and people of color communities in the Netherlands?
Sorry, I missed that part. Cleo, could you repeat it for me once again?
Yes, of course. So the question is, in what ways does climate change disproportionately harm Black, Indigenous, and people of color communities in the Netherlands?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. Thank you for that. I think it will be in the form of representation within the Dutch climate debate. Because from my activism, personal activism experience here is that we have basically been excluded from sitting on the tables, talking about climate strategies, about biodiversity strategies, or how these campaigns are, targeted, for example, areas such as Indonesia, where West Papua is still part from, while we are fighting colonialism and against genocide and ecocide. So I want to have a say regarding campaigns by, for example, Greenpeace Netherlands or Friends of the Earth Milieudefensie for campaigns in that area. And the narrative there, which is very problematic, for example, is about, saving trees and the orang-utans. Yes, we should do that. But what about the 500,000 indigenous West Papuans killed the last 60 years, which is a former Dutch colony? How is that possible? And how is it possible that a Dutch NGO is silenced about that? So this is my experience with other fellow indigenous activists and people of color in the Netherlands, that we still have to yell in 2021 to have a seat on the table, because we represent peoples from that area, and the peoples who have preserved more than 80% of world's remaining biodiversity in different places of the world. So yes, and that's really sad that we still have to fight as people of color, as within the climate change movement in the Netherlands. And just give another example. So that's first one thing, and it's West Papua, where I'm from, is the world's largest tropical island, housing the third largest rainforest after the Amazon and the Congo Basin. This is a frontline area. Dutch NGOs should know what is happening there, but my story is shocking the entire green climate movement. So without understanding what is happening, they're pointing at how are we going to save the biodiversity crisis if we even don't know what is happening. If we do know, why we don't want to mention it and bring the people sitting on the table to think with us. And if I can reflect on my last travel to COP26, I was invited by allies within the climate change movement to join the climate train. But when I sat in the train, you know, I was one of the few people of color with a lot of stakeholders. So I was glad with the opportunity, but all my friends from, for example, Extinction Rebellion, you know, I'm really glad they were there with groups, but they were facilitated, for example, by Oxfam Novib, the travel cost, the 1 week stay in Glasgow, and the only, as far as I know, indigenous climate change activist from the Netherlands has to find it for itself. And I reflect, brothers, that talking about inclusive COP26, these ENGOs should have a reflection for themselves as well. How are they going to facilitate people of color and marginalized groups and indigenous peoples from the Netherlands to represent in such COP? That's my reflection on your question, Cleo. Thank you. Back to you.
Thank you, Raki, for your very interesting points. So these are kind of part of like, this relate to larger structural issues that we maybe like, we can go into now. So Thomas, what are some examples of how existing social structures and institutions affect our ability to make poor environmental choices individually and also collectively? So like, how might we address those barriers?
I'll come back to that. I actually just wanted to add on what Raki said real quick, specifically regarding the fact that you're not given a seat at the table here. It's shocking because he's got a more Dutch accent than half of the people who might be sitting at the table as a representative of the Netherlands. And what I have noticed, especially just in the local political debate, the local Dutch people aren't pushing for representation of other people who live here because they have no idea. It's often completely flown over. The local media does not report the issues going on as a result of the local activity somewhere else, right? And I think that to really get more seats at the table for people of color, people from here will need to push the envelope, right? They will need to demand with their local INGOs that there are more seats created for those people, right? And not the same 8 seats going to the same, right, 8 people every time to have the same conversation. But coming back to your question, I believe I have a version of it written down. Sorry, you wanted to know about the sustainable practices and ideas that you would like to implement locally, right? And how we can individually do that, as well as a group. Honestly, in my experience, I speak from a context of Southern Africa. It's too late. Drought is not something you turn around, okay? So individually or communally, it's too late for action to be undertaken in those situations. However, what Evelyn did mention is if the countries with the financial resources to make actual terraforming technology available to those communities so that they can at least find somewhere else to maintain similar ecosystems where there might still be a chance for that kind of biodiversity to survive, then absolutely, you know, then those individuals will be able to go maintain the environments in the way that they usually do, with a little bit of a boost from the economies that are, as Chihiro touched on, purely extractive and divisive. And her point, in fact, earlier about this plurality of solutions for these issues that we see on just my experience again of how it's discussed here, just like with the representation again, there's no conversation about it. People do not know about the different ways that different communities are facing these challenges. You know, they only find out about a story because it's a story on the news. They don't find out because there are people telling them that they're going through these issues. Now that makes it very difficult to come up with solutions. There's a lack of awareness about the local situation. It means that nobody's actively thinking of them. I think the first place to start would be actively setting up communication channels between those places and here. you know, making sure that they're being maintained, making sure that they're being moderated, making sure that they're not diluted by trying to make like committees around things that also importantly dilutes accountability. It dilutes accountability when too many chefs are in the kitchen, right? It's also been a problem with these extractive economies. It makes it difficult to hold people from the past accountable for solutions that we still need to find out for. Right? And I don't know if that's answered your question, but it's certainly a way of thinking that I don't see individual people making solutions anymore, unfortunately, is my point of view on that matter. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, and I think you bring up some really interesting points. And I think it relates to one of the questions that an audience member submitted earlier. And they asked, like, they said, we often say that the dominance of white Western people in the climate justice narrative and debate seems to be indirectly silencing the voices of people who live elsewhere in the world and who do not actually have much to say. What do you think could be a good way to make their voices heard in terms of tangible, practical solutions? Perhaps, Thomas, do you want to maybe go for that one?
I think the best way for me to answer this question, rather than coming up with ways, is by telling you my approach. I came to Europe to study these things. It's been an incredible challenge to do so with all of the things that have gone on in the last 5 years, and keeping up has been a challenge, but I plan on basically just taking the information, working for these huge corporations, building up momentum, and then going right back, just taking it with me. I think that that's how we can start the conversation, is by not relying on, you know, a certain structure for it, but I'm certainly gonna take it back and see how much it stimulates locally, right? Because the more powerful I make their voices without relying too much on external sources, the more I can trust they have some agency in the matter, right? The more I can trust that they'll be able to look for more technically complicated solutions because they've been informed about them, right? That education has reached them by some measure, right? Or that technology has reached them by some measure. It's also kind of invasive, my approach, because it might be against what locals want to do. You know, it might be against how far they are willing to go to save the world around them, so to speak, and save their homes. So that's a challenge in and of itself. I think structural solutions, or these structural communication solutions in any case, should just be already existing because of the NGOs that are there to do this not being held accountable by local government. But that's another huge political issue, right? That's a rat's nest, so to speak. But I am interested to hear what Chihiro and Raki and Evelyn's thoughts are on this as well, because they're going to have plenty to say. You know, I haven't had my boots on the ground for a very long time. They certainly have.
No, absolutely, I agree. And I want to get maybe perhaps Evelyn's perspective, because you live in Uganda. It's a completely different, you know, system, politics. So what do you think could be good ways to make the voices of those who have been often silenced heard in tangible, practical ways in your experience? Maybe you can talk about that.
Again, I would like by saying the statement you made about the white Western people in the climate justice narrative, like indirectly silencing the voices of people who live elsewhere in the world. I think that statement is very true, and I have personally experienced it. I've seen people around me experiencing it, and it's evident how the media itself reports about the climate movement centering voices of mostly white activists. Some activists are being cropped out or not being included after speaking at an event. They are not being included or talked about that they were part of the event. We saw some incidences at the COP. and also how the global south, how people from the global south are being called missing voices, and yet they aren't missing. We are not just being heard, and our voices are not being amplified. And yes, that statement is very true, and it's evident through these things that I have just talked about, and seeing white supremacy for years happening, and it's just getting worse and worse. But again, I think what needs to be done is we need a system change, a system that ensures that everyone is listened to equally, a system that does not determine who is better than the other, who is lesser, or who is higher than the other.
Yeah, and perhaps Chihiro, you can also enlighten us.
Sure, yeah, I think this is a really important question. And I would start maybe just to pause for a moment on like, what is the frame about making voices heard? Because it kind of implies that the voices are too soft, instead of the listening is too bad. So like the question kind of that we need to ask is, what does it take for better listening of allies and so-called allies? There is a distinction between the people that are, the green orgs that are supposed to be on our sides, but often are very much missing in action, and the people who are just plainly not on our sides because they want to keep up the extractive economy. And so there is an element of reframing towards actually addressing the white supremacy within our allies and within the structures in which we move. The other thing is that it's not just about voices, it's about our bodies, and that our bodies need to breathe. And so the voices is also kind of a liberal frame of everything being a conversation and everything just being about ideas. And as soon as we understand a problem, it's solved, which is not the case, because there have been people making points and making analysis for hundreds of years, and the knowledge is out there. It's not a matter of knowledge or analysis or opinion or voices, it's a matter of power. And so what we really need to do is shift the power materially and socially. And so for that, I think what needs to happen within white stream environmentalism or environmentalism of the rich, which also sometimes include people of color that are more bourgeois, is to really stop the emergency activism, because the emergency activism values being busy over being with integrity. As long as you can shout you're the busiest, you're good. Instead of, are you actually taking care of your processes? Are you actually taking care of those relationships and making sure that you're not tokenizing, making sure that you're not just wanting to scoop up the people of color or the frontline communities when it only serves you for a moment to be heard 5 minutes on the mic in a setting that doesn't have any integrity and is within the wrong frame. So for that, I think what is needed to what could be a good way to assure listening and ensure safe bodies, I think that requires a lot of organizing on the ground. It's not coming from above. It's not coming from the nation state that has framed climate from almost the beginning as a national security issue, which then leads to further militarizing borders and further competition between which lives can be saved and which lives should be collateral damage. So it's not coming from above, it's not coming from the nation state. It has to come through community organizing that meets the problem where it's at. And it like Thomas was saying, we're not living in a world that has 10 years to save itself. We're living in a world where many communities have been impacted, pushed into loss, and many tribes have already faced extinction, are already gone. We're mourning so much that yeah, for me, this struggle really, I've seen more and more people like of color burn out in white stream activism, and I've still always been between spaces, still working with white organizations as well, and I think we need to work together. But I'm more and more, my theory of change is really working to strengthen our own spaces, our own infrastructure, so we have a more powerful way of setting the table, because just joining the table is not enough, because the table is rigged. And so if you're just offered participation, that's just another way of saying you're offered some representation for assimilation. If you cannot set the table, if you cannot rigorously say we actually want to dismantle colonial capitalism, and that should be our joint goal, and if not, then we're not, we're not allies. Then you can lose a lot of energy of trying to get into spaces, maybe have 5 minutes on the mic, be asked to, come in your own traditional clothing and everything, but then still be ignored afterwards. We've seen that with the cops for all those years since the beginning. And it's just, it's a carousel of harm happening each year. So yeah, I have a few links that I love to share in the chat. One for white organizations and groups that really want to be an ally to work through difference together, which I see thankfully more and more happening. Also shout out to people from XR who've just done an action here in Amsterdam to call out blackfacing and racism in the Netherlands, and calling for the dismantling of colonialism in a colonial museum. I'll share some pictures of that also in the chat for people who haven't seen this action yet. But I really believe it's through collective disruptive action and that we can build power, and also build up our own knowledge infrastructure to protect ourselves, because it's not coming from above.
Yes, thank you so much for these very interesting points. I think, Thomas, you wanted to ask a question, right?
Yeah, just a quick question actually to the folks who get to be on the ground a bit more. Evelyn and Raki in particular. So this idea that we can technologically empower local people to have a louder voice, because I feel like this challenge of, do we address the people who aren't listening, or do we address the fact that people have soft voices? I quite literally imagine myself showing up to a completely rural area that's been decimated by environmentalism, setting up pirate radio streams basically online, these kinds of things to essentially force the information out into the world, right? And then using things like XR or UR to publish or to publicize them through mainstream channels here, because they're clearly being moderated on the stages that the world sets up for the conversation, right? Would those kinds of things, like live streams and local capabilities to like reach the rest of the world, would that help in the short term, or only in the long term, or not at all?
Maybe I can go first. Before I answer your question, I hope you can allow me to add into something that the name is hard to pronounce, Chihiro, I just talked about. I've learned so much from her, and there's just something I would like to add on that she said about from what she said, and what I understood from it is that probably the people from the other part of the world have maybe an organization system that is not so good. And for me personally, I do not agree with that, because I think, again, it might not be even about the organization, because when my fellow activist was cropped out of a photo last year in January in Davos, after a press conference with about five other white activists, it wasn't about organization. This was clear racism. So I don't really relate it to us being organized or disorganized. And I have seen this personally at the COP, and while meeting with other white activists, I have seen it. I have seen like the discrimination and all that. Yeah, so I think for me, I would not really blame that on the system of us like organizing ourselves. And for your question, Thomas, I think again, I don't know if I understood your question well, but it's about maybe how we organize ourselves locally, and some of the activities that we do, if they can like get out there to the world. Yes, we do a lot of activities. With the few resources that we have, we take part in global strikes, where you find like globally everyone is striking, in Europe, in Africa, in Brazil, like everyone is literally striking. But at the end of the day, still the amplification of someone who has maybe done a campaign in another part of the world, let me say Africa, let me talk about us, you find that it's not like capturing that much attention, and this is so disturbing. You find very few people maybe retweeting about this or hearing about this, and then another white person carries out an activity, and it's like out there and everyone is supporting it. So that is still something that is so like disturbing. But yes, we carry out a lot of activities locally here, campaigns, and we do post videos on social media. We could be limited by maybe the live streaming and all that because of internet and everything, but I think this is something that can actually work, if I may say. But again, if there's something, maybe I go from your question about like getting the support locally. It's again very tricky to do very big protests or very big campaigns locally here because of security reasons, fear of getting arrested. Again, the system here is not so friendly when it comes to protests. They do not understand them. When you do a protest, you're actually mistaken for threatening the government or doing something that the government is against. So so many activists are getting arrested for protesting. So we don't have that privilege to go out on the streets and just strike so freely and protest so freely. So most times we are doing it from home and just posting, using social media to market our work. Yeah.
Thank you. That tells me a lot. Also that it's not really a short-term solution to become more technologically capable, because you're still going to be locally oppressed by the sound of it. Those streams will still be shut down by the hand that be, so to speak. Right. Thank you for the answers. Very enlightening.
Maybe I can just respond on one thing, because I think maybe I came across differently than I intended when I said getting organized. It's from the context of having worked with white organizations that you hope in some way, because they talk about human rights and they talk about intersectionality, that they're going to have your back, but they don't. And so when I talk about getting organized, I mean like having your own infrastructure in, like the Netherlands setting, to have POC-led organizations, or like in Germany now you have Black Earth Collective, and so, or in England like Wretched of the Earth. So you're not always dependent on a white organization allowing you to speak at a conference or whatever, but you can build your own your own media, your own structures. So it's not to blame anybody for not being organized enough, but more that for a long time here in the Netherlands, when you are an activist of color, you're kind of expected to educate all the white people, and then we will make, change together. But that strategy, sometimes it works and sometimes it really bites you in the ass, and you are exhausted, or people have burnouts, and more and more people opt out, also thinking like, we better build our own little collective of maybe 3 or 5 people in which we can take care of better processes and practices, than try to go for the masses, in which we actually have burnout culture and so many microaggressions and racism and duty of educating everybody else, that it's just actually leaving a lot of POC people burned out.
Yes, Candice, thank you, all the speakers, for the amazing comments, which I only can underline. I just want to reflect very shortly on the previous questions regarding the narratives of the global north and right environmental movements, and then to jump into Thomas' questions, which is very interesting from my point of view. But yeah, the only part I wanted to highlight is indeed that the narrative is racist from my point of view. If you look at the court ruling in the Netherlands from Friends of the Earth against Shell, which we support because now we got a stick, but the court also underlining it's about future generations. What about future generations? Indigenous peoples have been, and people of color have been killed since colonization started. In West Papua, 500,000 people dying. The Nigerian case took more than 20 years. What about future generations? So this is the perspective I bring in, and it's not about plans, the narrative. It's not about dangerous climate. It's about human lives, which are at stake the moment as long as these corporations can continue their activities. So you can see this broad narrative within all these green institutions, which we have to tackle. I want to change that, and this is how I jump into the question of Thomas. How can we organize ourselves? What I'm basically doing every single day with fellow Indigenous activists and activists from Extinction Rebellion as close allies is to bring in the Indigenous perspectives, this different Indigenous perspective from the front lines to the center of this political or public climate change debate. That it is about, extractive industries denying human lives of people in the global south, people of color, Indigenous peoples, and that the solutions are starting there as well. When we care and campaign for the rights of Indigenous peoples, the forest and plants will stay alive. They will stay in place. It's that simple. And if the environmental organization started that 50 years ago, and that didn't spend so much money on biodiversity, preserve ecosystems, preserve the forest, they all have failed. They are part of that problem. And that I am shocking them with fellow Indigenous activists when in one article 2 years ago shows the problematic position of theirs at this time and the role they have played in the deadly silence, what is happening on the front lines area. And still, we have to use a lot of energy and stress to demand our seat on the table. It's still happening. So what we have to do, and that is what I'm doing, I represent more than 1.8 million Indigenous West Papuans as spokesperson of our campaign. We are the house of the world's largest tropical island, housing the 3rd largest. I don't need their acknowledgement. They must listen to us, and I know what my people want. That is what I'm doing every single day to reclaim my narrative. And it's not about plants, it's not about animal costs, because in our vision, we are all the same. Indigenous West Papuans are on the same level as plants and animals. All beings are equal. So we must change the narratives, and I strongly believe in the slogan, systems change by story change. So let us have a bigger say, and they must start listening to us. And that's what we are doing. We are taking the lead. In Glasgow, we have launched the Green State Vision of West Papua. You can see it on www.greenstatevision.info. And we are, handing out to the environmental organizations, to the UN, that, we already have a solution. Just listen to us and facilitate us in what we want. And then the solutions will come on the table. Thank you. That's it from my side.
Thank you so much, Raki, for your comments. I propose we now take a 10 minutes break. So we could meet back at 5 over, like at 6:05. And yes, let's go for a little walk, grab a coffee or something, and let's meet up in 10 minutes.
Yes, so if everyone can slowly make their way back, that would be great.
I would just like to quickly say that Thomas's internet went out and he is trying to set up a hotspot on his phone, and oh, he is back just in time.
Great. I think we can jump back in. Yes, I think Evelyn is still with us. Her video is just still off. So yes, I just wanted to mention that we will still have a Q&A. We'll start that around like 6:30. So the audience members will have an opportunity to ask panelists questions, and you will have the opportunity to like ask them directly yourself. So that will be a thing. So yes, let's dive back in, and Cleo, you can take it away.
Yes, thank you, Candice. Okay, I wanted to ask questions to Evelyn. So our discussion now has been mostly about the present, but as it is often brought up, past structures of white supremacy still have an effect on us today. And we were wondering, Evelyn, and also the rest of the panelists, if you could shed some light about how the environmentalist movement has been shaped by colonialism.
I think there is a historical responsibility of the global north when it comes to greenhouse gases. The global north is responsible for the climate crisis. We people, especially from the global south, did not cause the climate crisis. For example, look at Africa. Historically, Africa is responsible for only 3% of global CO2 emissions, but many Africans are on the front lines of the climate crisis. This is a very horrible reality of this crisis. The people who did not cause it are being impacted most. They are suffering some of the worst impacts of the climate of the climate crisis. And again, as Africa or the global south is not on the front lines of the climate crisis, it's not on the front pages of the world's newspapers. And again, it's evident that while we're all in the same storm, we are in different boats, and some boats are sinking.
Thank you for these very interesting points. Does any one of the other panelists wants to? Yeah, Thomas.
I don't know exactly what it looked like before, but my father is a Rwandan man who had to flee for obvious reasons, and before then, climate change was already affecting the people in fishing villages around Lake Kivu, which is on the western side of the country, as well as the fishing communities that were dependent on the water flow between Uganda and Rwanda, right? One thing that I certainly noticed after there was huge governmental reform, again, for obvious reasons, was the local people were mandated to start cleaning up the streets on a weekly basis. And it was this national movement that was driven by the local people and is now only being applauded by the white people who show up to be like, oh, you guys are doing something about the littering and the CO2 and all of this honestly stuff that's been a problem for already a century, right? These have been practices, but it's only very recently that they've had a say in what they can do locally, you know, that they can set up these mandated days where they clean up the streets and these mandated days where they aren't allowed to drive, for instance. You know, I don't think it's fair to, I don't know how to close that point, but I just know in the context of Rwanda that the action came from the people only very late. And it's only because that's when they received it, right? They received the power to do so, the agency to do so. Most of these governments weren't even theirs until arguably the late 1900s, right? And even in the mid 1900s, the colonial governments that were then set up in atrocious, like, Commonwealth relationships that basically kept those economies extractive and kept those economies attached to the colonies that had set them up, right? I think that the whole white supremacy debate can end when they prove to the local people that they're also willing to take some responsibility for it and show up to do the same thing that the local people are, right? To go and take care of it, rather than to say, oh, now we know about it and we're sorry, I guess. I think that's one big, huge thing that could really be done. And Rwanda is a perfect example of it, to be honest. To be fair, it does have risks as well. If we use Paul Kagame as an example, he's practically turned into a dictator at the moment, right? But if you ask anyone locally, including like the people who were oppressed as a result of the French and Belgian regime, if we ask them locally, they bloody love it. They cannot be happier about the fact that somebody just wants to hold on to a grip, right, and not let it go to whatever corporate interest shows up with enough of a big checkbook. But hey, again, only contextual to Rwanda. I haven't been able to observe that anywhere else, really. Maybe people can add to this.
Thank you, Thomas, for sharing. I know not so much about Rwandan context, so very happy to listen and learn. I wanted to add to climate crisis being a colonial crisis. I think one of the things that the white frame shows up is by framing climate as something that has been a phenomena of the past 30 years, which is when NASA Hansen, brought it out in the end of the 80s. But that kind of sets a certain frame when already in science there was people raising attention towards the link of industrial greenhouse gases altering the climate or the greenhouse effect in 1896, which is in the midst of actually birthing the oil economy. Already the coal economy very much established. And so just by the fact that, these things were known already in the end of the 19th century, and the ferociousness with which growth was perpetuated and the violence that entailed, including warfare, a lot of warfare for resources, are things that I think are really important when we discuss the climate crisis as a colonial crisis, not just the attribution of how much every country emitted, but the fact that the imperial countries in Europe used so much violence and warfare to appropriate land, resources, to destroy forest already for 500 years. Forest deforestation is the second biggest driver of climate disruption. And you have these beautiful old growth forests, like in Latin America, I've seen from Chile, different trees that have like a diameter of like bigger than a person. And the mass cutting down of that, or like in Madeira, a Canary island, that was where it started in 1420, to just clear cut that entire island. In 1420, it started with the Portuguese invasion. Then they used it as a sugar plantation, imported the slavery system. And so we see that these drivers of ecological disruption have been really birthed in that colonial logic that has never been dismantled. When we talk about a post-colonial world, we talk about a world that has some flag independence, but getting a flag is not being decolonized. That's not the same thing. Power hasn't been decolonized. And finally, I think what really is needed is to look at how ecology itself, conservation itself, has been birthed in horrible racism and fascism. So the word ecology comes from Ernst Haeckel, a German guy who, I would say, had very eco-fascist ideology, He wrote around people who were sick or people who are of lower races, not, having to be erased by politics as biology. So this was after his life also kind of inspiring Hitler and the likes of other fascists. And so the idea of ecology being something neutral is kind of ahistorical, and conservation and national parks were really developed initially as a land grabbing endeavor for white pleasure, both in the States and in different countries around the world. And we see that some of the NGOs like Sierra Club, their founder, John Muir, was a racist. There are like different quotes from him that are directly attributed to racist ideas towards Black people and Indigenous people. So national parks have been used to kick Indigenous people off the land and prevent Black ownership of land. And we see that conservation today is still super colonial. The whole idea of the 30% by 2030 of world conservation is again rooted in the idea of land grabbing and kicking local people off their land and threatening the livelihoods of local people. So that's today in places like COP, in places where people talk about solutions, and they dare bring solutions like REDD+ and 30 by 30 that are mega colonial and do not solve anything, but do increase colonial dispossession. So yeah, that's my thing in the bucket.
Yeah, Thomas?
I gotta ask Evelyn, and that kind of couples onto what you're saying here. Like, Evelyn, we both know what Mugabe got up to in the last 30 years. We both know that the land grab happened the other way around, and that it wasn't just the idea of giving the land back to the local people. In fact, it ended up then being repossessed by the rich local people at the end of the day. And the whole endeavor just failed miserably, unfortunately. That whole "let's be racist back," which is also kind of Kagame's platform at the moment. He very recently kicked out a German ambassador who happens to be an acquaintance, and he told me why. But there is certainly a group of African leaders who are being racist back in order to gain control. But do you see that as a really effective way if the local population isn't actually being given access to the land again?
Okay, if I've got your question. It's about something that happened in our country in the regime of Idi Amin, something like that. I don't know. I don't think that's like the best way to have people like get their land back. But again, maybe some leaders are using this as a way of again feeling like of course Africa has a history of being colonized and all that. It has a history of the people from the north, from the Western countries coming to their countries and colonizing them and taking over their resources. And of course, that's why some leaders are using that that kind of way to chase them out of their countries. But I may not have a very clear explanation for this, again, because I don't think I'm so much of an expert in that, in like assessing that or something. But maybe if someone else could help me answer that.
Maybe I can give my perspective from Kenya just before Rocky also can add. I see you. I'm from Kenya, and I grew up moving around to Eastern and Southern Africa, and this is a very big issue, especially in South Africa, land reclamation and all this kind of conversation. And what I've found is this issue of how can we trust the politicians that are just feeding themselves? And I feel like this is a problem in a lot of African countries and in a lot of countries in the global South that I'm finding more that I research, that these kind of capitalist systems and ways of thinking are being put at the forefront in a lot of political systems and in the minds of a lot of political leaders, and leaving the people behind. And I think a lot of this has to do with these ideas about, a lot of them come from ideas that were implemented during colonialism about values, about land, about exploitation, about money and property, that don't necessarily fall in line with a lot of the values. I can speak for Kenya, a lot of the values in Kenya where it's very community-based, and you can see that there's an evident conflict between being able to provide for everyone, which is, it's a very community-based kind of culture, and kind of reconciling that with Western narratives of kind of individuality and fending for yourself or building, pulling yourself by the bootstraps kind of things. And it's a very big conflict where you have your leaders who are fending for themselves and kind of subscribing to this individualistic Western narrative. And, you have a culture that's saying, no, we provide for each other, we share quite a bit. And it's, you pose a question, I have no answer, but that's kind of what I see it as. It's a very big debate, and I think it will come to a breaking point, but maybe Rocky has something to add to that.
Thank you. No, not particular on this one. I have no experience on this, so I don't want to, saying wrong things regarding that. So if I may skip this one, but just reflect another question which I saw in the chat, which is, what do you think would be the best thing to do as white activists in environmental activism groups here in the Netherlands to emphasize this issue? I think this is, from my point of view, a very relevant question, because West Papua is a former Dutch colony, and colonialism didn't end there. We got ecocide and genocide happening there, and at the same time, the Dutch institutions, from history teachers, universities, media, politicians, are all silent. At least they don't know what is happening there. How is that possible? Well, this is a frontline area regarding biodiversity. So what I'm doing basically is, once again, from a personal point of view and experience, that the indigenous perspectives or the climate change perspective from our point of view is about, do we have a tomorrow? Are my people, is our culture not disappearing tomorrow? When is the killing stopping? And I want them to understand it very fastly, because the longer it takes, the more people will die. That is my climate change story. And to build the momentum here is to weaponize themselves. So I want to make them an ally within the green institutions, students on universities, so they can be a voice for me and my people and other indigenous community. So we build the momentum here. At the same time, we will share our story, and the truth, what I'm telling today isn't different than 100 years ago. It's the same story. We want to stay alive, and we want to have control of a land where we live for thousands of years in peace with nature. It's the same story. But so I want them to understand which structures have been denying us our rights. And these are the same structures who are very active, who created us, brought us to this situation. So I want them to understand the power position they have as students, white students as well, as employee within a green environmental institutions, or as politicians, and make them to understand and acknowledge the truth and the reality on the frontline areas, which isn't something new, which we have told them for decades, for centuries, and how they are willing to listen to what the solution from our point of view would be. And in the Netherlands, it is very clear. Let's break the deadly silence regarding what is happening in West Papua, which is their former colony, and also what indigenous peoples all around us and people in the marginalized group want to say regarding climate justice. Yeah, that's what I want to say. Back to you, Cleo.
I wanted to maybe challenge that, because you say we had this an event a while back where we were discussing Emma DeBerry's book, What White People Can Do Next. I think that's it's a book, people should check it out. But it's this idea of allyship, and I think that's kind of what you're getting at, allyship. And she just mentions in her book this kind of idea that allyship has this narrative that is still puts people of color in a position of they still look helpless. You know, we're allies, we have to help them, as opposed to we are working together. And I think that's do you kind of agree with that? Or how would you frame that in terms of a Dutch context? How can we have white activists and white allies without having this kind of narrative of we're just here to help you and we still have the power, but you know, we'll help you and improve your lives and all these kind of things? Yeah.
Thank you, Candice. That's an interesting question. No, you're absolutely right. And, you know, allyship is a broad word, right? You can have it in different forms. So what I've seen is that there are allies who are demanding that, you know, for example, that I or other fellow Indigenous activists should have a seat on the table. So they would take a step back. That could be an example of allyship. Or they can, you know, push me to have a higher place as candidate politician because he is the voice of the Indigenous peoples, for example. So yes, you know, it's fluid, but it's also a power, you know, dynamic. So yes, it's a collaboration, and they must understand and listen how they can facilitate the best. I think that I hope I can define. That's the kind of definition I'm looking for. So listen and see how you can facilitate. That's a good ally to the person next to you. I hope I've clarified or answered a little bit your question.
Yeah, and I would perhaps maybe also like to get Chihiro or Evelyn's perspective, because you're also in the activist space. So maybe you can.
Sure, yeah. So I always answer that question with another question, which is, what are you good at? You know, because I believe not all white people are the same and you have different things to bring to the table. So if you are an activist that does direct action like XR, then I think a good example of good practice is the London airport shutdown that happened a few years back, in which the white direct action movement or organization took the biggest risk, which was like going on a landing strip of the airport and shutting it down. And Black Lives Matter was in control of the storytelling, and they told the story through video of how they were living in a place that was suffering most from the pollution of the airport and the extension, but least likely to fly because of less money and resources. And so in that sense, it's an action that comes up over and over again as good collaboration, in which you work together, you don't get segregated, but you look at what are your abilities, your skills, your privileges, your what is needed. And what is needed was a different story and told by people themselves. And what was needed was, you know, people taking lots of risks with their body. And they looked at that situation and divided in a way that I think was very contextualized, in a way that was aware of itself. Like, in what way can we do this in good relations? So that's I have the link here for people who are not familiar with that action. But if you're a lawyer or if you're a photographer or if you're a politician, you know, your help or your allyship might include totally different things. If you're a chef, the revolution requires all skills. And I do think that for developing good relations, you need to work on your historical knowledge. Whatever you work on, if it's like fast fashion or food justice or oil or oceans, you need to learn the history of harm, because otherwise you're always going to be a fragile ally that is in need of extra education and might just, you know, act out of innocence and really put you actually dump a lot of needs on the people who you're supposed to be in kind of community service too. And yeah, I think finally, like really having clear conversations around what liberation looks like, because allyship comes with a joint dedication towards liberation for you, liberation for me, liberation for the greater us that is both human and non-human. And so there, I think it's also important not to skip that vision work, because allyship gets hard. It's a hard thing to do. It's you bump into your own privileges in a clunky way, and you bump into your own inabilities of things you've never done before, and it's going to get hard, and then you suffer oppression as well. So you need a strong container of a joint vision and good relationship. Those are the things that are going to hold you through the long process of not just being an ally for a day or for an Instagram post, but for that long tail liberation work. So those would be my three things. Look at what you're good at. So you're really positioned in what your allyship could look like. Also relationship work and historical homework in whatever field that you are doing anti-oppression work in.
Yeah. Does anyone else want to contribute? Thomas, you put something in the chat. Do you want to?
Oh, right. That was just an adjustment on what Chiro said, actually. I don't think enough people with the skills that they might have honed and arguably might be more difficult than other people's skills are prepared to be held accountable for the history around those industries, right? And that's I think a very important point which you made, is like a lot of people don't know where they're coming from, but they certainly want to be focused on where they're going. And then they get hit with this big moral brick wall, so to speak, when they are held accountable for something that's been happening in the past, which they didn't know about. I think that's also very important.
A book I often recommend is Decolonize Wealth, which is written by an Indigenous author who works in philanthropy. And in the first half of the book, he kind of unnerves the dynamics, the colonial dynamics, the racist dynamics within philanthropy, in which the big money kind of lands with the same folks or the same type of organizations. And the second half of the book is looking at practice, like different steps of actually changing the structures of foundations and funds from a very practical position. And I think it's super helpful also for people who are doing any kind of change work in which they feel, but I'm one of the good guys and I want to be one of the better guys or people, to kind of go through that process of step by step, from the process of listening and learning to listen in better ways, to apologizing. We're not used in a capitalist society to apologize for anything. If you ever not had your mail delivered and you call the post, the corporate capitalist post, they'll find 1,000 ways to say that it's not their fault. And so we've been kind of programmed to never never be accountable for anything. And I have here a picture that I recently looked at. I don't know if I can put a picture in the chat, but it's the 5 dysfunctions of a team. And it is a pyramid. I don't know, maybe I'll send it through mail because I can't put it in the chat. It says on the base of the pyramid, it says absence of trust. And then the second layer is fear of conflict. The third layer is lack of commitment. The fourth is avoidance of accountability. And the top is inattention to results. And I feel like that's a lot of things that I see where things go wrong, not just in general in teamwork, but especially when it comes to willingness to deal with racism in the green work.
Thank you, Chiro, for your comments and the rest of the panelists. I think it's very inspiring and I'm learning a lot. So maybe I thought we could go to the Q&A and let the attendees ask questions. So if you have a question, please raise up your hand and then the tech crew can unmute you, and also you can show your video to ask it directly to the panelists. I see that there's one question in the chat that's already been answered by Chiro, but maybe the other panelists could look at it as well. And are any panelists aware of the donut economics model of Kate Rathworth? And do they think it includes spaces for the most affected communities? I'm not finished with the book yet, but I'm aware it's written by a right British Oxford University professor. I think Chihiro, you answered. Maybe do you want to repeat this in the discussion?
Sure, I just want to check if there's somebody else who wants to go first, because I've just talked a lot. And I see Annemiek also has a hand. So what I wrote was that I am familiar with it. I didn't read the book, but I'm familiar with the donut economy thing. It pops up a lot in conversations. So I have nothing against the person. I don't know her that well, but there are a couple of things that kind of trigger me into not being that interested in it. And one of the things is that I kind of reject the idea of how the donut economy is often positioned as innovative 21st century economist. This is also one of her works is called 21st Century Economist something. When I feel we really need to recognize other types of knowledges, like traditional ecological knowledges, knowledges that have been literally burned, like libraries have been burned, have been forbidden, like Indigenous people in Australia and California were not allowed to do slow burning practices that maintain the land. And where people have still upkept that practice, there are no wildfires like there are in California and Australia. So there's so many knowledges that are not just about ecological knowledges, but ways of being and ways of doing and ways of governing. And for me, my emphasis in learning is way more about reclamation than the idea that modernity will save us if only we're innovative enough, because I kind of reject the idea that innovation will save us. It kind of is situated in this idea that humanity is the smarter one than nature. The donut as metaphor, kind of, I feel like it's this greasy, sweet, modern invention that's not good for you, but somehow has appeal for a certain audience. But yeah, for me, I tend to want to remember, and so I scout for awesome Indigenous books of Indigenous studies or anti-colonial ways of understanding our ways of being.
Thomas, do you want to add on to that before Annemiek asks their question?
Yeah, simply with a case study that I would like people to look up on very, very deeply, if they have the time, regards to Chihiro's reluctance to follow this 21st century economics or 21st century agriculture. And that's simply to look at the Brahmaputra and the Ganges river basins in India, and look at what's going on there with Bill Gates and his cronies. Read into Vandana Shiva's work, read into what the Bangladeshi agricultural infrastructure, which by the way provides in terms of caloric output, around 30% of the world's food. So it's definitely worth looking into if the 21st century economy is something that we're going to put our faith in.
Thank you. Anamika, do you want to ask your question?
Sure. First, thank you so much for this discussion. It's been extremely interesting. And Chihiro, I also really agree with the point that you made about your skepticism of donut economics as a new thing, and really valuing the practices and knowledge that have already existed for a very long time that fall under what has more recently been coined as things like circular economy, but that have in reality existed for a very long time. But my question is a bit separate. You, Chihiro, referred to white organizations, and you referred a lot to those, and I was curious exactly what you mean by that.
So that would in the Dutch context almost include every green organization, except for maybe Bloei en Groei, ALS, Free West Papua, and a handful of foundations that are doing indigenous work when it comes to the green. So anything from the Milieudefensie, Greenpeace, NGO world, agenda, to grassroots, to education. It's embedded in a white stream logic with certain things, like I think Thomas was also raising around his universalist claims to answers, or technological or scientific as a knowledge source that is above other knowledge sources. Things that are rooted in emergency, in perfectionism, which is premised on the idea that there's one good way. And kind of a disregard for relationality, and I also want to include like non-human relationality. I remember when I made my film Radical Friends in Bolivia, it was based on the premise that I was interested in the struggle for rights for Mother Earth. I'm just talking to film funds, to broadcasters about that. I cannot replicate the stares and the disregard for wanting to do something that was steeped in a different knowledge of the earth being alive and a relation and worthy of rights. It was, kind of thought of as, I don't know, almost childish or something, to hold those beliefs. And I have the word white stream from an author, Sandy Grande. She wrote a book, Red Pedagogy, in which she looks from a Native studies perspective on different critical studies, from anarchism to feminism to critical race theory to queer theory, and kind of looks at a red lens, Indigenous, Native American lens, and she used the word white stream often to kind of make explicit what kind of thought or organization she was putting her own positionality in contrast with, and I found it very helpful.
That makes a lot of sense. Thank you very much.
Then we have another question from Lila.
Oh, sorry, Rocky's hand is raised.
Sorry?
Rocky, go for it.
Yes. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, I just wanted to make a quick remark regarding the donut economy. With the idea is wonderful, but my problematic position regarding my own political party, which is Green Left, who's outlining innovation as climate solution, is just a false and dangerous mindset. Why is that? Because we have to reflect that innovation has brought us into the situation we are in now. Since the industrialization is that the carbon emission increased just the last 50 years, and that all the animals have died, the half of all the animals the last 50 years. This is what innovation brought us. So the donut economy, if we don't understand the structures and the power inequalities, we don't realize that our way of life, our way of consuming is the problem. Extracting resources for our way of life is where it's all about. So if we wanted to make a donut economy without understanding that we have to reduce our consuming somewhere, our energy use somewhere, we're going to exploit more of what we had before. So in my climate train where I joined, about my topic was a sustainable travel for all. In the context of climate justice, I said, where are these resources coming from? And where are we going to reduce energy use? Because the net is already overloaded right now. And an electric car costs more energy to build than a normal car. So without understanding that, this donut economy is going to make the climate crisis even worse than where we are now. We're going to build a green capitalism without reducing the one we have now. So these are some important things to reflect on when we talk about innovation. What does it mean, and who is it going to affect once again? Just to have it very clear. Thank you.
Thank you, Raki, for this addition. Sorry, I didn't see that your hand was raised. So I would like to go further with Lila's question. Lila, do you want to ask it live here, or shall I read it out loud?
I think just read it out loud for now.
Okay, I will read that. Oh, yes, she can ask it. Cool.
Yeah, sorry, I just had no idea how to unmute myself to reply. So my question was that at multiple points in the talk, you mentioned the need for a system change, or basically needing to change the system. And I was wondering if any of the panelists could elaborate on what measures could be taken and what shape this change could take in order to ensure that all the communities are respected and empowered. And that's my question.
Maybe we can start with Evelyn.
I think system change is something very simple, something that is a part for the politicians or the world leaders to play. It's basically changing the current systems that are destroying the people and the planet, changing their policies, making the right decisions. Like we talked about just transition at the beginning of the webinar. That is part of system change. Transitioning to renewable energy, it's part of system change. And again, treating everyone equally, giving people equal opportunities equal opportunities in every part of society, like leadership. When it comes to leadership, most times we see that it's so full of men, and women are left out in leadership positions, this is still part of system change, and racism itself is part of a system change that we need to see. We need to see that more people of color are represented or included. So the process of system change, I think, is basically political. Enough political will. I feel like it will be so hard for us to have that system change, because the leaders, they know everything to do. They know the solutions. They have the solutions, but they do not. They just lack enough political will to change the systems.
Thomas?
I think, again, just to sort of add a point to that and sort of, how do you say, support it with the idea that we can build technological systems to support these things. And like what Raki was saying, innovation being the way forward. It's sort of contradictory, like he said. But one thing that we sort of need to stamp out in young activists is this idea that renewable energy is in fact renewable, right? Every resource, just by definition, is finite. And that being the priority of the conversation must remain the priority of the conversation, right? Screw wind, screw solar, it's gonna run out. The point is the world will run out. It's about how long we can keep it going in a certain way. That needs to, I think, change before we can start setting up systems on a foundation that's already sort of, I don't know, shaky, right? It's already contradictory, and that's it's important to know.
Thank you, Thomas, for your addition. Vicky has, oh, Chihiro, do you want to say something?
I love this question. Yeah, I have to. So there's a whole list of things, but in the interest of time, I'm just going to mention, I think, two things. One of them, in terms of implementation for system change, is ending the military budget. All oppression is backed up by force, or the threat of force. It's also the United States military is the biggest emitter of the world. It pollutes more than 100 nation states put together, and they are exempt from emission reductions from Paris Agreement. They're also exempt from many environmental laws like Clean Air Act and a bird species protection. They have a huge lobby. So they're both violent to humans and to the rest of the web of life. And it's a huge budget. That budget has been reimagined in the Cochabamba proposal, which Bolivia made at the climate summit in Copenhagen in 2009. And then further elaborated in 2010 at the Cancun climate summit. It has been worked on, the Cochabamba proposal, with over 30,000 delegates of a Earth summit that they had in Bolivia, in Tiquipaya. And if you type in Cochabamba proposal Earth Summit, you can read that. It's a lot more radical than the Green New Deal because it's a lot more practical, and it envisions putting that military budget to use for the just transition. So you can find, we often talk about the 100 billion of aid for adaptation that was promised and never allocated properly. Here we talk about, I don't know, I think at the time in 2009, it was like 1,400 billion. So 1,400 billion a year. And I think military budgets are only rising. So that's a huge thing to reallocate that. The other thing, which has been on my mind lately, I can phrase as end politocracy. So politocracy is not a word that exists. I invented it. It is a conflation of two words, pollution and plutocracy. So plutocracy is what we have right now, a world run by the rich, where 8 people have more than 3.5 billion. So we know that plutocracy is wrecking the planet. It's creating huge deficits and huge surpluses. Pollution is the other side of the medal, because a world run by the rich is one that is in disbalance, and that's also seen ecologically. And it has the idea that it can dump excesses or appropriate from the commons for private profit. So ending the plutocracy, I think a concrete measure there would be to not just talk about minimum wage, but talk about maximum. Like, what is the maximum that one individual could hold? So even if you put that pretty high, like at $1 million or something, all the rest that is bigger than $1 million would have to be held in a public institution or entity, or something where more accountability is held, and more democracy in deciding how to allocate the bigger budgets would go. So those are two measures that I think would be super helpful in reducing harm. And while they seem like very much out of the conversation and way beyond, I think we should remember that a year ago, or 2 years ago, I should say now, people wouldn't imagine defunding the police as a feasible, winnable campaign. But we've seen how the immense organizing and the immense courage of the Black Lives Matter movement and have resulted in different cities experimenting with defunding the police and allocating different tasks that have been put in the police force in actually social services. So I think we have to be bold, because without system change, we have a collapse that entails our species collapsing as well. So yeah, those were my things.
Thank you, Chiro. We'll move to our last question of this panel discussion, which is from Vicky, and I will read it out loud. Is there something that needs to and can happen structurally at the university level in terms of decolonial environmentalism? What should activist students be pushing for, demanding from their institutions? Is one of the panelists, like, what do they want to respond to this question?
Thomas and then Rocky, yeah.
Just in the context of engineering, stop giving access to the young minds to companies like Shell and right, like, enough of that, right? Enough of working together with these bastards, to be honest. Demand that you get more options, you know, and if you aren't given those options, go look for them and bring them forward. A lot of you might find your professors will support you, because a lot of them are forward thinkers, a lot of them are open-minded. It's just that they're spoon feeding you what's easiest. They're spoon feeding you also literature that's been pre-provided. Okay, now that's not to say that the literature is bad or that the organizations themselves are bad. It's just that you are immediately limiting yourselves by following along, so to speak. Actively seek out literature to bring forward to your professors. Actively seek out newer opportunities, more open-ended opportunities when it comes to things like internships and when it comes to things like collaborative projects. I think that that's a good place to start.
Yeah, Rocky?
Yeah, amazing proposal first by Thomas, supported obviously, and I just wanted to highlight the amazing initiative already made by students from experience of our campaign, that they have, you know, demanded the teacher to invite us or other indigenous activists to give guest lectures. But also, I think what we've shared here, this should be a mandatory part within a green hub as Wageningen University, which is the green hub of the world regarding innovation, ecosystem, biodiversity. But these are the perspectives that are have created blind spot for the last 50 years, that they're shocking when I or other indigenous activists are educating them about, it's about human lives, it's about people in the front lines. So students can create a lot of pressure by joining a poll where they demand decolonizing indigenous perspective in environmentalism. I just gave a lecture last week because an XR fellow activist demanded or asked me to come, and they've also take down a flag of the University of Wageningen at the Complex University and hoisted the West Papuan flag on a national day last week. This was historically because Unilever is located there as well, one of the biggest importers of palm oil, and Indonesia occupying West Papua is one of the biggest exporters of palm oil. They're destroying our land. So this is a collaboration which is very powerful in their face. And at the same time, we are bringing in crucial perspective within the institution. So that is where allyship is a clear example of allyship. And I'm respecting them and hope we can build more momentum, but it should be an institutional responsibility for environmentalism in the broad sense. So it shouldn't be students' responsibility to ask us and push pressure, but that's reality. So I'm asking them to allyship, use their voice within the institutions. Yeah, that's it from my side.
Yes. Does anyone? Yes, Chihiro, you want to add something?
Yeah, maybe just a small thing. I think a lot of good things are already happening when it comes to activism in university spaces, like also the prolonged actions that have been taken to like boycott and divest or get ABP, the pension fund, which is like the biggest pension fund in the Netherlands, that has been very dedicated to fossil fuels and colonial extractivist projects and funding it to get out of it. And there's been a recent win. This really has taken like a decade of work, and often the bigger wins are really shouldered by many generations of people putting in the work. But I want to give a shout out to that work because it's been significant in the Dutch context. And a very practical thing is actually instituting green spaces in university, as in not green spaces of privilege, but like having mandatory classes with your hands in the soil, of actually having gardens that are needed to also be upkept, because we are so impoverished in terms of our knowledge of working with the soil in Europe, to decolonize that. And I've also had conversations with Raki about this. Like, we talk in the Netherlands of higher education and lower education, and we also challenge that framing in terms of like, you can have theoretical education and practical education, and we should have respect for other knowledges also in university, to have the knowledge to grow your own food, because the people that don't know how to grow their own food or have no access to land are very susceptible to go along with supermarkets that only have unfair trade products, because you can't grow your own food. So like bringing back capacity and knowledge in terms of growing your food, I think is super needed, and also kind of deconstructs the idea of what it means to be a student. It's not just about drinking beer and I don't know, whatever the image is of student life, but to actually have students that get on their knees, put their hands in the soil, and have to pass some tests about basic human skills of growing food.
Yes, thank you. We do have a lot of questions, and at this point, we have gone over time, but I'll take this opportunity to ask any of the panelists if they would be willing to extend the time, maybe by another 5-10 minutes, to answer one or two more questions. If not, that's okay, and we can end it here. Is that okay? Okay, great. Because there are a lot of questions, and I want to start with possibly Anne-Mai's question. There have been many mentions of the lack of representation and attention from, sorry, it's blocking. Yes, there's have been a lot of mentions of the lack of representation from Western media on the front line and global South environmental issues. Are there platforms or sources any of you can recommend? Very happy about the links already been shared.
I'm waiting for somebody else to go.
Possibly Evelyn, are there any resources that are maybe Uganda specific or things to do with the African community or people that might inspire in these kind of conversations in your context, if you're still there?
Can you repeat the question?
Yes. So the question is, there have been many mentions of the lack of representation and attention from Western media on the front lines and global South environmental issues. Are there platforms or sources any of you can recommend or you can recommend that highlight these kind of issues of the global South environmental issues?
I don't think so, because I think the media is not really acknowledging this, that some voices are being left out of the media and are not being amplified. So I don't really think there's so much of this being spoken about in the media. I think the only time I saw this being spoken about was when Vanessa was cropped out of a photo in Davos, and this went viral. And this is like a time. This was like the beginning of her becoming so popular, and I still don't know how this became so like spoken about by everyone, every media. And again, when she was cropped out, we had so many people coming out to speak about this because so many people who had the same experience and had never talked about it. So they got the courage to talk about it, how this has actually happened to them. And I think that's also the only time I saw the media in my country trying to cover her. But after that whole incident, I haven't seen the media like support activists a lot and be able to cover stories even locally, because even at COP26, we had our own media not like cover us at all. They were literally just covering the leaders, the presidents, that talks at COP26, and we did not have any interviews with the local media, and instead we were having interviews with the international media. So I don't think there are so many spaces where the media is talking about this.
Okay, I'm gonna go if nobody else is gonna go. Okay, so there's so many resources. I'm gonna start with this link. It's a playlist on YouTube. They're all decolonial climate justice talks that I've just flagged in a playlist. They're around 60 talks or something. I have some other playlists on this channel that are like reclaiming Indigenous knowledge or specifically around reparations. But this playlist around decolonial climate justice talks, I think, is a good place to start. It has a lot of people who are also authors of books, but you can get to know them for free in a talk. Another resource that I can recommend is from my own website, an article. I give workshops on climate racism, and so I often get asked about what else. And so I made this article where I list some of the books that helped me in my initial thinking, or books that have come along later, or articles that friends of mine or that I wrote. It's How We're Breaking the Silence Around Climate Racism. So that's the second link. Then I haven't really heard today, but if there are Spanish speakers in the crowd. Oh, this is the wrong link. Can I delete it? I don't know. One of the links is faulty. But the Spanish speaking platform I could really talk about is Avispa Media. It's based in different countries in Latin America and middle America. And some of their articles are also in English, but they write a lot around land defenders, local struggles. And so it doesn't always go through the climate lens, but it's really the ground struggles. There's also, for India, there's a platform, BARI, like PARI. It's for the farmers and rural people. So again, it's not specifically on climate, but it really gives on the ground representation, and is quite unique within the Indian context as well. And then finally, I would have to find the link here, share the link of my own feature film, which is the film I made in Bolivia. And it's kind of an activist coming of age story, kind of looking how to make a difference and deal with many questions of, I don't know how to do system change, but I want to do it. And that's the last one is Radical Friends. There, and that's all.
Raki, do you want to add something to this?
Yeah, just for those who wanted to know more regarding West Papua, they can follow our campaign website, which I'm going to share right here in the chat. Because as we see today, the reality is that the global mainstream media are still silent. As a matter of fact, Indonesia have still banned foreign media to report in West Papua since they invaded it in 1963. Foreign media is still banned. And what our campaign have done, oh, so I see I put one E too much, freewestpapua.org. We got all kinds of resources and information if you wanted to collaborate or get more reports about what is happening in West Papua. And I shared our vision we've launched in Glasgow. Also in the chat, do it here once again, for those who want to know that we are not only victims, but we are climate leaders as well, and how we have envisioned our way out and offering the world a true solution, which is decolonized and giving the land back to the people who take care of the land. So that's it from my point. Thank you.
Thank you, Raki. Evelyn, do you still want to add?
I think I forgot to share something in case anyone else would like to read about anything related to climate change and maybe its connection to racism. There's a book that was launched. It's called A Bigger Picture by Vanessa Nakate. It's about a fight to bring a new African voice to the climate crisis. I'm trying to look for a link to share it, but I think the link is not sharing, but that's what I wanted to add on. I'll just get the link and share on the chat.
No, thank you. And I think we'll end here. I want to thank all of the panelists for sharing and really enriching our lives today. I know I feel very, very much more educated and a lot more inspired to go look out for, more knowledge and actually act and see how I can apply these things in my lives. I encourage all the attendees to also not stop the conversation here, keep having the conversation, keep acting, go out, really talk to your teachers, your professors, your friends, your family about this, and really keep the conversation going, because that's the only way we can really start having the conversation about a just transition. So thank you so much from Work in Progress and University Rebellion, and we hope to see you in the future soon. Okay, bye.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone. Thank you so much.